Before we begin our journey on this tranquil night, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're joining from. It's always delightful to discover where our listeners rest their heads as they travel with us through these ancient memories. How to die in the Middle Ages, 20 common and absurd ways. I remember with an odd clarity the first time I heard that even bread could kill a man. Not by poison or witchcraft, but by pure and honest carelessness. It was a particularly damp winter, and the village baker, a man of few words and many fungi, insisted on storing his loaves by the blacksmith's forge, thinking the heat would keep them fresh. A young, starving peasant, bold and reckless, bit into one of those hardened loaves with the strength of someone who'd never known fear, and broke 2 teeth, one of which got infected so quickly it took the poor lad before the snow had even melted. They say death lurked around every corner in the Middle Ages, but what few people tell you is just how absurd it could be. Take, for instance, the case of Bedtime, an old shepherd who fell into his own well while trying to rescue his dog, who in the end wasn't even in there. The well was narrow, the ground slippery, and the fog that morning reduced the world to grey blurs and fading hope. They found him 2 days later, clinging to a bucket, as if still trying to pull the world of the living back up with a soggy rope. But it wasn't just water that held hidden traps. Fire, too, was a traitor. Many houses had poorly built fireplaces with chimneys that preferred to blow smoke back into the home. I knew a woman, Isabel, who lost her husband on one of those nights. He fell asleep near the brazier, drunk and wrapped in a woolen cloak. The fabric caught fire slowly, and no one noticed until the smell of burning mixed with the stew. He was buried with the pot, out of respect or irony. I never found out which. Then there was the cold, silent, creeping, almost polite. Many didn't die in a storm's fury, but during quiet nights when the breeze seemed to only play through the cracks in the wall. I once met a boy named Lothar, who fell asleep in a barn after a long day helping in the fields. He covered himself in straw, nestled against a sleeping goat, and never woke again. They said it was the cold. I think it was loneliness, mixed with exhaustion and an unwilling blanket. But tragedy wasn't always so poetic. Sometimes it was pure comedy of errors. Imagine slipping on a fish, not a metaphor, a literal fish dropped by a rushed vendor in the marketplace. The stone floor, covered in scales and brine, turned walking into a precarious dance. A woman, well known in the village for her scandalous laugh, slipped like that, hit her head on a barrel of fermented cabbage. Everyone laughed until they realized she wasn't getting up. Other deaths crept in, disguised as routine. Wet shoes, for instance, a dangerously underestimated threat. In my youth, a blacksmith named Tom walked for days with soaked boots after crossing a stream to deliver horseshoes to a distant lord. When he returned, his feet were swollen and blackened. They said it was bad humors in the limbs. Today we'd call it infection, maybe gangrene. They cut off the leg with a woodsman's axe, no anesthesia, and still it wasn't enough. Wet leather claimed more lives than any spear. And then there were the roofs. Those charming thatched roofs that look so romantic from a distance, but all it took was a careless spark, a forgotten candle, and within minutes the whole house turned into a torch. And if the fire didn't claim the body, the smoke stole the breath. A family that lived near the mill was found huddled together at the center of their burned home. They say they were praying. I prefer to imagine they were telling stories, trying to laugh until the end. Animals, too, were a threat. Not wolves or bears, but the familiar ones, the ones you named. A woman once died after being knocked down by her own cow. The cow was pregnant, the cow, not the woman, and in a foul mood. One badly aimed kick, one unfortunate fall, and that was it. She broke her spine in a quiet field, surrounded by daisies and the cow's bewildered gaze. Her husband said the cow mooed for days, as if mourning or apologizing. He never knew which it was. And if you thought only living things could kill, think again. Think roofs. So many died buried by their own homes. The clay dried and cracked, the wood gave way after too much rain, and suddenly, while you slept or shared a piece of hardened cheese, the sky collapsed. There was an old man who died crushed by a beam while reading Psalms out loud. His grandson swears the last word he spoke was Amen, as if signing his own farewell. Of course, we can't forget the diseases, those with gentle names and ruthless outcomes. A cough could be the beginning of the end. An untreated pimple, a flea bite, a cut from a rusty kitchen knife, all invitations to fevers that burned like oven fire, delirium, and a long, quiet wait for the last breath. There was a miller named Ranulph who scraped his finger while grinding barley. Just a finger. Days later, he was delirious, calling out for his mother who'd been dead for 30 years. He passed the next morning. The finger was buried with him, as a keepsake or a warning, and then there was the food. Ah, the food, which sometimes seemed to conspire against us. An undercooked egg, meat left in the sun too long, cheese that had developed a personality of its own. I remember a wedding where all the guests fell ill after eating pork pie. They say the pig was already halfway dead before slaughter, which might explain the strange taste. The wedding was marked by vomiting, fevers, and in the father-in-law's case, an early funeral. They say the groom considered it a blessing. But those are just rumors, like so many in those days. Even rivers, those that seemed so serene in the glow of dusk, held questionable intentions. Many died trying to cross a stream they thought they knew. All it took was one smooth stone, one unexpected current, and there you were, carried off like loose firewood, pockets heavy with coins or turnips, your head banging against invisible rocks. A curious village boy fell in while trying to recover his wind-blown cap. They found the cap. He never turned up. Then there were the more peculiar accidents. A fat, proud knight once choked to death on a peacock feather, one of the decorative ones at a feast. Another, distracted during harvest, drove a hoe through his own foot and chose to ignore it. The wound rotted before the leaves even began to fall, and a particularly vain woman fell from a stool while trying to hang a polished mirror on the wall, a gift from the market fair. Broke her neck. The mirror, they say, remained intact. Death, it seems, sometimes had a sense of humor. Even churches, those stone sanctuaries of silence, could set the stage for your final act. There was an altar boy who climbed the bell tower to ring the bell and was struck by lightning, right as he was calling the faithful to Mass. Some said it was divine punishment for stealing communion wafers. Others claimed God just needed a punctual bell ringer. Either way, they rang another bell that day, a lower one, more solemn. And no one ever left the windows open during storms again. Then there were those who died from too much devotion. A monk once fasted for 40 days on bread and water and forgot one minor detail. The body, however devout, has limits. On the 33rd night, his chant became a sigh. He died peacefully, forehead to the floor, stomach as empty as the monastery halls at midnight. When they found him, they say he wore a faint smile. Or maybe it was just rigor mortis. In the Middle Ages, even that was ambiguous. And how could we forget the medicine? Or rather, the well-meaning experiments involving herbs, roots, and wildly misplaced optimism. I remember a barber surgeon who prescribed onions with honey and mercury for almost everything. A baker with a persistent cough followed the treatment. The cough disappeared. So did his life. In the village, people started saying the barber cured everything, but only once per patient. And then there were the games. Yes, even moments of leisure carried their risks. A young squire died trying to impress the blacksmith's daughter during a barrel-jumping contest. Slipped on the second, hit his head on the third. The girl married a carpenter months later, one who hated barrels. And an old man, nearly blind, died laughing during a game of dice. Laughed so hard, they say, that he stopped breathing. A good death, perhaps, especially for someone who had spent a lifetime dodging worse ones. Of course, death also came riding in carriages pulled by bad ideas. One villager once tried to build wings from goose feathers and beeswax, climbed onto the church roof and threw himself to the wind, full of faith and a wide grin. For 1 second, he hovered. Then he fell onto the milkman's cart, startling the cows and breaking a leg, his own and the cart's. He died days later from a fever, but swore to the end that for a moment he had flown. And who are we to say he didn't? And then there was the risk of being too polite. A man traveling to the fair stopped to help a stranger whose cart was stuck in the mud. The stranger thanked him, offered some wine, and went on his way. 3 days later, the Good Samaritan was dead, poisoned, not out of malice, as many assumed, but by a poorly washed barrel, full of mold and drowned rats. The lesson learned: sometimes kindness kills, especially when it comes with free drinks. And as strange as it may sound, many met their end simply by sitting too much. That's right. Old peasants, after decades in the fields, suddenly spent their days sitting by the fire, resting their legs, scratching their chins and forgetting to move. One after another they fell ill. Swollen legs, sluggish lungs, and before long, a deep sigh and the end. Healers called it the immobility sickness. The midwives just said, the body forgot how to walk. Some still laughed about it, while keeping their legs moving, and of course, there were the dogs, not always loyal, not always sober. A farmer once died tripping over his own dog, stretched out asleep in the darkness of the stable. The animal, they say, awoke with the fall, fled in panic and never returned. Another man was bitten by a rabid dog after trying to take a bone from its mouth with his bare hands. Canine etiquette, he called it. He died foaming at the mouth, delirium in his eyes, and a bite on his pride. The dog, ironically, survived. Even food, when it didn't kill by spoilage, killed by ambition. An elderly man, proud and gluttonous, challenged a group of young men to eat an entire goose and plum meat pie. He ate quickly, laughing loud. The laughter turned to choking. The choking turned to silence. The pie won. At the funeral, they said he died happy, which may be true if we consider he died clutching the dish. Ever since, the village saying became, "Eat like a peasant, live like a priest." And let us not forget the perfumes. Ah, the perfumes. A merchant once returned from France with a vial of powerful essence made from flowers, amber, and something unidentified. He sprayed it on himself before a feast, hoping to impress. Minutes later, he fainted between 2 barrels of fish, scared away a dozen guests, and never woke again. Some say it was the strength of the perfume. Others, that the fish was worse than it looked. Either way, the vial was buried with him, just in case. Even prayers, if offered at the wrong moment, could be fatal. I recall a hermit who lived atop a hill, praying 7 times a day, rain or shine, hunger or lightning. One night during a storm, he climbed to the stone where he said his daily prayers and knelt as always. A bolt struck him right there, swift and precise, as if the sky had decided to cut the conversation short. When they found him, his hair was singed in the shape of a halo. He was buried as a martyr or a stubborn fool. The difference around there was subtle. And finally, there were those who died from confusion. A deaf peasant thought the village bell was calling for the harvest, not the curfew. It was plague season. He went out with hoe in hand and a smile on his face, crossing empty fields and locked doors. The illness found him still in the orchard, picking pears. He lasted only a few days. Some said it was ignorance that killed him. I've always believed it was hope, and maybe the lack of a decent messenger. In the end, dying in the Middle Ages wasn't a matter of bad luck. It was routine, a stumble, a sip, one unfortunate gesture, And there it went, another name, another story, another bed left empty by sunrise. But there was beauty in that too, because between one infection and the next, between falls, coughs and festering wounds, people still laughed. They still danced, still told bad jokes by the firelight, and still fell in love, even knowing the world was a minefield that smelled of onions and peat smoke. And perhaps that's what moves me most when I remember those days. The quiet courage of choosing to live, even while surrounded by so many ways to go. Each sunrise was a victory, each night by the fire, a gift. Because life in those days wasn't guaranteed. It was earned day by day, with thin soup, torn boots, and a stubborn faith that fit inside a crust of bread and a tight embrace. And so, between loss and laughter, the Middle Ages went on, and we who remain still whisper their stories, very softly, so as not to wake those who now sleep. You're stuck on a medieval ship, with rats, storms, and no bathroom. I remember clearly the first time I set foot on that old merchant ship, or rather slipped, because the deck was always damp, coated with a film of salt, dried mud, and broken promises. It was the autumn of a year I've since forgotten, and the sky seemed to press down on us, wrapped in fog and whispers of ancient winds. I was young, foolish enough to believe the sea offered freedom, not nausea, mouldy biscuits and rats with more rights to shade than the crew. And the smell? Ah, that smell. Damp wood, grimy ropes and dried fish, all seasoned with a generous pinch of despair. I slept that first night with my back against a barrel of cabbages, already counting their own final days. The night breeze came in through a gap in the hull, cold and salty, as if the ocean itself were breathing on us. The rats didn't wait for ceremony. They came in procession, owners of the place, crossing beams and nets with the elegance of faded nobility. One of them, the grey one with only one ear, used to watch me from the shadows, as if he knew neither of us had a choice in being there. And strangely, I found comfort in that. The third day was when the captain decided it was time to sing, to keep the storm away. He climbed the deck, his beard stuck to his chest with sea spray, eyes squinting like he could see beyond the horizon. He opened his arms, inhaled deeply, and began to chant an old melody, something between a prayer and a threat. We, the passengers, pretended not to hear. Maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear that the storm might hear and decide to join the chorus. Truth is, we all knew. There was no map, no destination, only the hope the wind might take us somewhere the wood didn't creak so much. Meals were an event of low expectations and difficult digestion. A thin fish broth, served in dented pewter bowls, was our daily feast. Sometimes there was bread, hard as a tax collector's conscience. And when luck smiled, or mocked us, we found a piece of salted meat, the origin of which no one wanted to discuss. The lack of a toilet wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a central part of the experience. Buckets were treated like sacred relics, and the sea, oh, the sea, was both our road and our sewer. We learned to live with the smell. Or rather, the smell learned to live with us. At night, the ship groaned like an old man complaining about the cold. Every taut rope, every creak of the timber was a reminder that this tired hull was still fighting against the waves and against time. We slept huddled like spoons in a drawer, each trying to forget where we were, who we were, and how long it had been since we last touched solid ground. The wind hissed through the sails like restless spirits, and sometimes I imagined the whispers came from the sea itself, telling tales of ships swallowed whole, of sailors who fell in love with mermaids and never returned. There was a strange routine in that floating chaos. In the morning, someone would spit on the deck and declare it a good day. A foolish superstition, but somehow comforting. The captain drank his mug of sour wine and consulted the clouds like sacred scrolls. One sailor, named Gregor, spent his days trying to fish with a hook tied to a rusty nail. He never caught anything but hope, yet he kept at it. And then there was me, of course, sitting near the main mast trying to write in a journal that soaked more than it recorded. The words ran off the page the same way seawater leaked through the deckboards. One afternoon we were caught in a storm that seemed to wake up in a foul mood. The sky collapsed over us with ancient fury, and the sea, once a sleeping giant, rose in waves that looked ready to swallow sky and ship in a single gulp. The rats disappeared first, as if they knew more than we did. Screams mixed with the snapping of sails and the drumming rain. I clung to the railing with hands stiff from the cold, each drop on my face like a needle. The captain, of course, sang. A stranger song this time, hoarse, nearly a dialogue with the wind. And for some unfathomable reason, the storm eventually gave in. The next morning the silence was more frightening than the thunder. The sea was smooth as a dirty mirror, and the ship, soaked to the bones, swayed slowly as if it too were recovering. Some of us laughed for no reason, others simply stared at the horizon, trying to understand if we were still alive. And it was in that moment, as we laid our clothes to dry under the shy sun and watched the captain sleeping with a goofy smile on his lips, that I realized there was beauty in all of it. Rustic, salty, uncomfortable, but beauty nonetheless. As the days passed, we learned to read the moods of the sea, like the wrinkles on an old friend's face. We knew when the wind carried bad news, when the seagulls vanished without warning, and when silence spoke more danger than any thunder ever could. We developed our own language, one of gestures, glances, and elbow nudges. No one needed to say the fish had gone bad. All it took was the cook's wrinkled nose before serving. Aboard that ship, even the rats had routines, nightly routes between sacks of flour and forgotten compartments. One of them, bold and cunning, began sharing crumbs with me. I named him Rodrigo. Rodrigo was a constant presence, day and night. He'd come quietly, sniff around my corner, and look at me with small but resolute eyes. He never touched me, and I never tried to drive him away. It was a tacit agreement, like so many forged between companions in misfortune. Sometimes I spoke to him about solid ground, described trees, fresh bread, the scent of soap. He never answered, of course, but I felt he listened, and in the end, that was enough. Because there, among leaking barrels and soaked sails, any creature that wasn't screaming or trying to shove me overboard was more than welcome. It was a friend. One day, we thought we saw land, a dark smudge on the horizon between heavy clouds and the mist dancing over the water like veils. The crew stirred, some laughed aloud, others wept in silence. But it was nothing. Just an illusion of light and longing, one of the many the sea offers to those who stare at it for too long. The disappointment didn't last. We'd learned not to cling to the promises of the horizon. It was better to trust the steady sway of the ship, the voices echoing between masts, and the certainty that even without a clear destination, we were still moving forward. The sea didn't tell us where, but it promised we would arrive somewhere. Or not arrive, which, in the end, is also a kind of arrival. The captain said nothing that day. No song, no stray verse to the wind. He just stared eastward with sunken eyes, like a man remembering something forgotten centuries ago. But that night, we heard him murmuring a soft lullaby, almost childlike. Something about a woman waiting by the river, holding a lantern in one hand and warm bread in her apron. No one interrupted. We all stayed silent, listening to that hoarse voice fading into the creaking timbers and the moaning sails. It was a sad sound, but curious, as if he was singing not for us, but for the ship itself. And perhaps that's exactly what it was. A wordless farewell, an apology, or just another attempt to keep the storm away. On calmer nights, when the sea behaved and the wind seemed drunk with fatigue, I let myself close my eyes and imagine I was on land. The ship's rocking became the sway of a hammock beneath a leafy tree. The scent of salt and dried fish turned in my mind into the aroma of bread rising in the oven. The groaning hull became distant music from a village untouched by storms. In those moments, I forgot the rats, the cold, the hunger. I simply breathed slowly, counting the stars peeking through the clouds, as if they might somehow remember I existed. Rodrigo came in those moments too, with light steps and curious gaze. Sometimes he'd sit there on my folded coat, as if we were sharing the same thought. There was something sacred in that quiet companionship between man and rodent, between one creature and another. On land, he might have been nothing but a pest, and I nothing but a drifting dreamer. But there, among damp ropes and blackened masts, we were two travelers, surviving together through boredom and vastness. And as strange as it sounds, it was there, in the most uncomfortable place in the world, that I found a delicate kind of peace. Once, one of the older sailors, they only called him Martim, told me he had sailed for 40 years and still never knew where the sea ended. Maybe it doesn't, he said, staring into the void, as if searching for his past among the waves. Maybe the sea only ends when we stop looking for it. Those words stayed with me, because on that ship, without a reliable rudder, without trustworthy maps, and no clear destination, it was easy to imagine the entire world made only of water, wind, and waiting. And strangely enough, that didn't scare me. It was as if, by ceasing to seek the shore, simply drifting became enough. The days began to blur, diluted in a constant haze, and a time that didn't flow, only swayed. We no longer counted hours by the sun, but by the number of biscuits still dry in the barrel, by the sound of ropes slapping against the mast, or by that moment when silence grew thicker than air. Hunger stopped being urgent and became routine. Discomfort turned to habit, and the longing for home, for firm ground underfoot, became such a constant companion that it too felt like home. The sea, in all its vastness, hadn't swallowed us with fury, but with slowness, and we, in return, learned to call it home. Then, on a morning as indistinct as so many others, something changed. The smell of the air was different, sweeter, less salty, as if the wind had swept across fields before reaching us. A shout came from the top of the mast, hoarse but filled with a forgotten kind of joy. "Land!" Everyone rushed to the deck, stumbling, laughing, crying. We didn't know where we were nor who would be waiting for us there, but it didn't matter. It was ground. It was an end, or perhaps a beginning. The captain said nothing. He simply looked out toward the horizon, touched the brim of his hat with his fingers, and walked down to his cabin, softly singing a tune only he knew. That night, before we docked, I sat for the last time beside the barrel of cabbage. Rodrigo appeared, as always, and climbed onto my shoulder without hesitation. "You should stay here," I whispered. "The land isn't made for dreamers like us." He looked at me, then disappeared among the coils of rope and empty barrels. I never saw him again, but to this day, on stormy nights, when the wind howls in anger and the house creaks like an old ship, I think of that little grey rat and that salted deck, and I smile. Because no matter how long and uncomfortable the crossing was, it taught me that even among rats, storms, and the complete absence of bathrooms, one can still find shelter and memory. End of the crossing. Good night. You've been sent to a medieval school. Good luck surviving it. I can still smell the damp parchment mixed with linseed oil, the distant echo of the chapel bell marking the beginning of lessons. And that knot in the stomach, not from the morning wind, but from the certainty that today someone would forget the paternoster and pay dearly for it. It was a school, yes, but not like you imagine today. There was little color, no recess, and an almost sacred reverence for pain as a method of learning. I was small, my knees always stained with earth, and my hands trembling as I held the wax tablet, trying to remember whether Gloria came before or after Spiritui Sancto. The building itself was an extension of the church. Cold stone walls, rough wooden benches that punished the spine more than any penance, and windows too high to glimpse the world beyond. We were there to learn, they said, but what we learned most was to fear mistakes, to fear the master's stern gaze, to fear the sound of that ash switch slicing through the air before landing on our fingers, as if trying to beat out the sin of forgetting. Still, there was a quiet pride in reciting a passage from St. Augustine without stuttering, a silent relief that warmed more than the pale sun that rarely reached us. Our master, Brother Theobaldus, was so thin and straight he looked as though he'd been carved from a single beam of oak. His eyes, always half shut, weighed on us like millstones. He spoke little, but when he did, his words came in Latin, dry, sharp, and with no room for doubt. We had to copy them precisely onto wax tablets, using iron styluses. One spelling mistake earned a reprimand. 2 meant extra prayers on your knees. 3, well, let's just say the ash rod was not merely a symbol of ancient wisdom. It was God's ruler in human hands. There was something strange about time in that place. The mornings felt endless, the light filtering through cracks in the stone and dancing slowly on the dust hanging in the air, as though the very minutes were reluctant particles. Sometimes, during lessons in liturgical chant, I'd find myself watching the nearest candle flame, wondering if it too trembled in fear like the rest of us. It was in those moments, between one psalm and the next, between a mistake and a slap to the back of the head, that the mind wandered, and for a brief instant forgot the weight of the tablet, the chill of the floor, and even the Latin that surrounded us like a heavy fog. But reality always pulled us back. Brother Theobaldus would slam his rod against the desk, a sharp crack that made the crows in the bell tower shudder. "Memoria est the mother of salvation," he'd say, and we all knew it wasn't a metaphor. We learn not just to read, but to memorize, word by word, verse by verse, like stacking bricks in a wall that kept ignorance and compassion at bay. Some boys cried quietly, others hardened into stone, and I simply prayed that the next one to forget St. John's verse wouldn't be me. Sometimes during the breaks, if you could call those brief minutes between lessons and prayers a break, we'd step out into the small courtyard, surrounded by tall, moss-covered walls. There, silence was nearly complete, broken only by the creak of a distant water wheel, and the sighs of classmates who, like me, used the time to rub numb fingers or adjust robes soaked with dew. We didn't speak much. Words were dangerous things outside Latin. A stifled laugh or a whispered vulgar phrase could earn double punishment, so we limited ourselves to breathing, deep, slow, as if each exhale were a rehearsal for freedom. Still, there were moments of unexpected beauty, like when the older boys recited the Psalms in unison at sunset. The Latin echoed down the stone corridors with such solemnity that even the sparrows fell silent in the beams of the roof. It was as if, for a moment, suffering found meaning, as if all the pain, the beatings, the fasts, the endless copies converged into that single moment of vocal harmony and reverence. I remember closing my eyes during those instants and feeling a serene warmth in my chest, as if heaven itself had leaned in, just for a moment, to listen. But of course those moments were rare, drops of honey in a chalice of vinegar. Most of the time, life at school felt like a constant crossing between fear and endurance. There were lessons in arithmetic, of course, done with little pebbles on sandboards, and the basics of rhetoric, though that was reserved for the more advanced students, usually sons of nobles or important clerics. For the rest of us, Latin sufficed. Latin, the Psalms, and the understanding that to make a mistake was more sin than learning. Learning to read and write was like crossing a frozen river. Every step was a test of faith and patience. I still remember one particularly cold morning when a boy named Thomas forgot the order of the commandments. He was a small child, with alert eyes and trembling hands, always with a red nose from the cold. He had barely hesitated on the fifth phrase when Brother Theobaldus was already on his feet, rod raised, face as expressionless as the statue of St. Augustine behind him. The beating was swift, dry, methodical, as if it were just another lesson. Thomas didn't cry, at least not in front of everyone. But that night, when we slept curled up like sparrows beneath thin layers of straw, I heard muffled sobs coming from the corner, and no one said a word. Because at that school, to learn also meant to learn to stay silent. Over time, we learned not just the lessons in the books, but the invisible rules that governed that small world of stone and silence. We knew where to step to avoid making noise, when to meet a master's gaze, and when to look away, and even how to hide a piece of stale bread in our sleeves to share with a hungrier classmate during long vigils. There was a kind of underground wisdom between us, built in glances and small gestures, that made survival a form of silent brotherhood. It wasn't friendship in the light-hearted, joyful sense we know today, but a quiet pact. You help me remember the Song of Simeon, and I'll cover for you if you doze off during matins. Despite the harshness, or maybe because of it, there was a strange sort of pride in belonging to that school. When after months I finally managed to recite the beginning of the Gospel of John from memory, with a steady voice and eyes fixed on the wall behind the master, I felt a strange warmth rising in my chest. Not exactly joy, but something close to it. Brother Theobaldus gave no praise, of course. He simply nodded once, short, stern. But it was enough. That small tilt of his chin was worth more than any reward. It was the invisible medal that marked the beginning of something new. I was no longer just a boy afraid of the rod. I was, finally, someone who knew. The seasons passed almost imperceptibly behind the walls of the school. Spring brought a damp smell of earth that crept through the narrow windows and mixed with the scent of old wood, but it changed little in our routine. In summer, the heat dried the inkwells too quickly, and the weaker boys fainted during litanies, yet no one was spared. Autumn, that one was cruel, cold winds that cut like glass, and leaves that piled in the corners of the rooms, bringing scorpions, ants, or tiny messages left by brave hands. And winter. Winter was the school's true master. It taught more about patience and endurance than any psalm ever could. At night, we huddled under coarse cloaks, sharing a faint warmth and the hope that the next day would bring fewer punishments and more mercy. Some whispered prayers under their breath, others simply stared at the dark ceiling as if searching for answers among the beams. There was a strange comfort in that routine, as if, despite the cold, the pain, the constant watchfulness, something inside us had begun to bloom. And that was what no punishment could crush. The quiet spark of understanding, of language, of discovery. Because even if we were taught through fear, there was beauty in the sound of a well-formed Latin phrase. And we knew, deep down, that those words would one day open doors greater than any we had ever dared to dream. One day we were taken to the library, if one could call it that. A dark room where the books were chained to the tables like precious prisoners. There, among thick leather volumes and manuscripts illuminated by patient and nearly saintly hands, I touched a real codex for the first time. It was heavy, cold, and smelled of old dust and melted candle wax. The brother who led us said nothing. He merely opened a page with reverent care and let us look. The letters danced like tiny black flames across the parchment, and in that silent moment, I understood that those words held power, real power. Not the power of the rod or the switch, but a power born in the mind, spreading beyond anyone's reach. It was also that year that I began teaching the younger boys. Nothing official, of course, just whispering translations during breaks or helping them adjust their styluses on the wax tablets. To see the relief in a boy's eyes as he grasped a phrase, to see fear give way to comprehension, was like watching a candle being lit on a long, dark night. Perhaps that's what made it all bearable. The idea that, despite the methods, despite the cold, despite the silence, we were learning. And that learning was something not even the harshest master could take back. In time, I left the school. My feet followed other roads, and my mind was taken by other lessons. Some gentler, others just as harsh. But I never forgot those cold corridors. The sound of Latin echoing off stone, and the way those words, even when memorized under threat, became a kind of shelter. Brother Theobaldus grew old, they say. His rod lost strength, but his voice never stopped sounding like a thundercloud held back. And though the memory of his punishments remains vivid, it was he who first handed me the keys to a world I hadn't even known existed. Today, when winters grow long and the nights feel colder, I find myself remembering that narrow room, the stylus in hand, the fear of making a mistake, and the discovery that even the harshest knowledge can, in time, become comfort. Because there are things you learn from books, and others you only learn by surviving them. And somehow, in that school where Latin hurt and faith was measured in bruises, we bloomed, slowly, silently, like whispered prayers in the dark, unheard by others perhaps, but heard by God. You've been accused of witchcraft in the Middle Ages. There was a night, many years ago, when the cold whispered through the cracks in the wood and the branches tapped gently against the thatched roof. I was sitting by the flickering light of the hearth, sewing an old apron with crooked stitches, when I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't urgent. It was the kind of knock that carries silence behind it, heavy, deliberate, as if a shadow itself had decided to visit. And there, between the scent of smoke and burnt rosemary, began the strangest and most delicate story I've ever lived through, the day I was accused of witchcraft. They entered without a word, 3 men and a woman, her eyes half shut, like someone who had already passed judgment long before hearing a thing. They brought nothing but sharp words and stares heavier than any chain. One of them held a small book, its edges worn, as if leafing through it were part of the ritual itself. They asked if I could read. I hesitated, not out of fear, but because I never knew whether that was something to confess or to hide. In those days, printed words held the weight of spells, and the sight of a woman reading seemed, to some, more dangerous than any midnight curse. They said someone had seen me gathering herbs in the field at dusk. They were for teas, chamomile, elderflower, a pinch of lavender for restless nights. But to the right ears, that was enough. Then came the sneeze. A single sneeze let loose in front of the chapel on a cold morning, and someone, perhaps just bitter with their own luck, decided it was a sign of the evil eye. From that moment on, everything fit the puzzle of fear. The black cat that had followed me since it was a kitten, the village child who fell ill after drinking from the well near my door, even my habit of talking to myself while I cooked. In the blink of an eye, the ordinary became suspect, and the simple, punishable. They brought me to the village square the next morning, before the sun had strength enough to warm the dew. I walked past neighbors who wouldn't meet my gaze, as if guilt could be passed with a single look. The wet stone echoed beneath my slow steps, and for a moment it felt like I was dreaming, a grey, quiet dream where everything was slow and inevitable. The judge, a man with thick eyebrows and fingers that tapped constantly on a worn oak table, asked if I had anything to say in my defense. I did. But how do you say the world is wrong when it has already decided you no longer belong to it? Then came the tests. First, they tied my hands and feet with coarse ropes and said they would throw me into the river. If she floats, she's a witch. If she sinks, God will receive her. A trial where innocence meant drowning and guilt meant a different kind of death. They tied me carefully, almost gently, as if trying to soften the cruelty of the act with delicate motions. When they threw me into the water, everything went silent. The world disappeared, and all that remained was the cold, a cold that slipped into the bones, that erased thought and replaced everything with a breathless white void. And when I finally surfaced, coughing, shaking, alive, I heard the murmurs. The decision had been made. They pulled me from the river with hands that barely touched me, as if fearing the contact might curse them. Someone threw a thin wool cloak over me, not out of compassion, but so I wouldn't die before the sentence. I was left alone in a small stone cell, where the wind slipped through the cracks and the damp clung to my thoughts like company. The straw on the floor was thin, but enough for the rats who watched me in silence, as if they too knew that time in that place wasn't measured in hours, but in sighs. At night, the church bells echoed off the walls like a reminder that the justice of men walked hand in hand with fear. The next morning, they announced I would be tested by iron, a trial, they said, to separate the liar from the virtuous. They brought out a bar of metal, heated until glowing red, and told me I would have to carry it for a few steps. Then they would wrap my hands, and after 3 days, if there were no wounds, I would go free. For God protects the innocent, they said. But everyone knew, myself included, that even saints bleed. The bar was placed in my hands with the solemnity of a sacred chalice, and in that moment, I understood. It wasn't my skin being tested. It was the patience of mercy itself. The bandages were wrapped with almost ceremonial precision, and I was left alone once again, not in a cell this time, but in a room where the air hung heavy with the scent of old wine and melted wax. During those 3 days, time passed thick and slow, like cold honey. They came to see me only once, to change the water jar, and to observe my silence. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I only listened. To distant footsteps, to whispered voices behind doors, to the soft crackle of firewood in the hearth of the room next door. It felt as though the whole world had shrunk to fit within that space between doubt and pain. When they finally unwrapped my hands, I noticed their eyes before I saw my skin. A restrained look, disappointed, as if they'd been waiting for a miracle that never came. There were blisters, red, raw, silent witnesses that iron speaks louder than any prayer. Murmurs spread through the room like wind sweeping through ripe wheat. Some looked away, others crossed their arms, satisfied. For me, there was only exhaustion, not of the body, but of the soul, as if all stories, all prayers, all memories had been left behind in that cold corridor, between the furnace and the verdict. That afternoon, I was brought again to the village square, this time under the direct gaze of everyone. There was no surprise in their faces anymore, only that quiet curiosity people reserve for inevitable tragedies. The wood of the platform creaked beneath my feet, and the smell of smoke in the air wasn't from the baker's oven, but from the pile of kindling carefully stacked nearby. Someone whispered that the logs had been brought from a distant house where the fire caught quickly. It mattered, they said, that the flames burned fast, for mercy. But mercy was a word that walked alone there. The parish priest read words about the soul, about repentance, about grace, but his eyes never found mine. Perhaps he had doubts, perhaps only fear. The crowd mumbled prayers, but none of them belonged to me. I looked at their faces. The baker, who once gave me warm crumbs at the end of the day. The midwife, who once asked for tea to ease her pains. Even the little girl with dark braids, whom I'd taught to braid lavender stems. All of them there, watching, waiting for the wind to change direction, or for justice to find another name. But names back then were handed out faster than anyone dared refuse. The executioner was a broad-shouldered man with hollow eyes who spoke no more than necessary, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of respect for the silence of final hours. When he approached, I felt the world around me shrink, as if even the sky were holding its breath. The wood, the hay, the rope, everything seemed to have been waiting there for a long time, waiting only for me. He didn't touch me with violence nor with tenderness. He simply did his part, like someone sweeping the floor before dusk. And there, with my feet on straw and my hands still marked by iron, I understood. The end, many times, doesn't come with a scream, but with a stillness so calm it confuses even the angels. But the end didn't come, or at least not in the way they expected. A messenger interrupted the ritual, breathless and dust-covered, holding a piece of parchment stained by haste. The judge read it in a low voice, his eyes widening little by little, and then he sighed. Someone had interceded. A distant lord, whose name I'd only heard whispered beside the loom, had overturned the sentence. Perhaps out of charity, perhaps out of interest. It hardly mattered. The crowd murmured, and the fire that had been waiting to be lit was, instead, scattered. The flames returned to the ground in the shape of uncertain footsteps, and I was brought back to life. Not as a heroine, nor as a saint, but as an uncomfortable reminder of a nearly committed mistake. I was released without ceremony, as if my return to the world were an inconvenient detail, something that needed to be forgotten as quickly as possible. There were no apologies, no reverence, only doors closing quietly as I passed. The house where I'd lived was still there, tilted with age, the thatched roof and the familiar scent of dried herbs. But something had changed. The walls, once warm, now seemed to watch me with caution. The neighbor who used to greet me now looked away. Even the cats, once so confident in their strolls along the windowsill, walked with more restraint. Yes, I had returned, but I had left something behind in that square. And still, little by little, life folded itself back into the rhythms of the everyday. The herbs returned to my hands, the teas returned to the fire, and the hearth returned to crackle on cold nights. People, with time, returned too, shy, in search of advice, of remedies, of stories to chase away pain. No one spoke of what had happened, as if silence were the only way to keep reality at a distance. But there was a new weight in their eyes, a kind of quiet respect mixed with poorly digested guilt. And even without words, I knew, in that village where justice walked beside fear, I had become more than a woman. I was now a living memory, proof that the world could sometimes be wrong. The seasons passed, and with them came harvests, fairs, candlelit births, and whispered funerals beneath the rain. Each new cycle brought a breeze of normality, as if time, in its quiet persistence, could smooth even the deepest creases of memory. I went on with my work, stitching bandages with thread and lavender, listening more than I spoke, touching with hands that still held deep within the warm memory of iron. Sometimes a child would call me witch, but with a mischievous grin, not with fear. And I would smile back, neither denying nor confirming. Because there, among cauldrons and infusions, to be a witch might simply mean to understand the pain of others. On the coldest days, when the fog drapes the fields like a worn cotton sheet, I sit near the window and let the kettle sing. And there, with the steam sketching invisible stories on the glass, I sometimes find myself remembering it all, not with bitterness, but with the kind of longing that only exists for things that should never have happened. I think of the faces, the eyes that looked away, the fingers that pointed, and of how fear can make even the kindest forget who they are. But I also think of the quiet miracle of survival, of having come back, of still being here, with the kettle, the window and the herbs, with my name intact, even after they nearly tried to burn it with me. And so the years passed, not like rushing rivers, but like persistent drops, slowly shaping stone with patience. The children who once peeked at me through fence slats grew up, became mothers, farmers, men with full beards and weary voices. And strangely, many came back. They asked for remedies for their children's cough, a balm for their grandfather's aching knees, or simply a story to soothe nights when sleep refused to come. I gave them everything I could: herbs, words, silence. And they, without knowing it, gave me something in return. The soft feeling of still belonging somewhere, even after everything. Today, when the wind blows from the east and carries the damp scent of the first fallen leaves, I sit on the same bench, the one by the old oven, and let the world spin around me. Sometimes a new visitor will ask about the marks on my hands or about the old rumors that still drift across the rooftops. And I simply smile, stir the broth in the pot, and say that some stories, when told well, warm more than the fire ever could. Because in the end, it doesn't matter what they once said I was: healer, sorceress, witch, or shadow. I was, I am, and I will always be someone who knew how to listen, and who, even if just barely, survived.